Vanity of vanities, says Koheleth, vanity of vanities, all things are vanity. Only once a year do we hear from this particular book in the Bible on Sundays, and so it's really important to spend a little bit of time diving more deeply into this very important book of the Old Testament under the name Ecclesiastes, which means assembly or church. The name Koheleth is something like preacher, one who's taken from among the assembly to preach to the people, to the church. And really the heart of this particular book in the Old Testament is precisely the word that gets repeated over and over again, vanity, which in the original Hebrew is habel. And habel has also kind of a depth of meaning that it could also be translated in the term breath or vapor or mist or something like bubbles even, which is to say something that is exceedingly fragile and vanishing. So think of maybe like on a cold morning day when you go out and you can see your breath in front of you almost just for an instant, and as soon as you see it, then it kind of disappears in front of you. Or a bubble that you might be blowing in front of a party or celebration, and as soon as you go to try to touch it or grasp it, it pops before you. So vanishingly fragile things. Koheleth, who we know, at least in the tradition, is understood to be King Solomon, one of the sons of David. He's reflecting back on life and realizing that everything is breath, vapor, or mist. It doesn't last. What are the things that last in life? I mean, very few things endure. I mean, we might look at, a mountain. A mountain might endure, but even mountains are changing over time, over millions of years, based on the climate and rain and all the rest that happens, earthquakes that might move even mountains. So what is it that actually endures for eternity? Well, there's only one thing, God, who in fact is not a thing, but existence itself. And he's revealed himself to us as a person, Jesus Christ. So he's the only enduring and eternal being. God alone has existence in himself. Everything else depends on God for its own being. Vanity of vanities, all things are vanity. All things are fleeting. I was maybe around 10 years old, and for those who are maybe around my age or maybe a little older might remember a very fleeting kind of popular item. They were called slap bracelets. Does anyone remember slap bracelets? Well, they were the hot thing for about 2 seconds when I was growing up. And on a particular occasion, I was visiting my grandparents, my dad's side of the family, and I happened to have my allowance in my pocket. And when I accompanied one of my uncles to the gas station to go get a few things, maybe some ice or whatever else, I noticed that, beautifully displayed behind the counter were just this array of slap bracelets that I really, really wanted. And so I took out my allowance, the $20 that I had, and I bought 20 slap bracelets. And I slapped them all up my arm, excited. And just as I had put them on my arm and was getting back into the vehicle, my uncle laughing at me the whole time like, you're going to get into trouble. I get home, and of course, my dad notices this foolish thing that I had done as a child. And then I came to realize how foolish it in fact was. I mean, the excitement of having something that I wanted, as soon as I obtained it, as soon as I possessed it, I realized, well, I have no need for 20 slap bracelets, and this is one of the most foolish things I've ever done. A tough lesson to learn. I wanted to take some back. They wouldn't accept them. Once the sale was done, you own it. It belongs to you. Now, a bit of a silly story. True story, but silly story. At every phase or stage of life, there's something like that we go through. I mean, in high school, most of us are concerned about making good grades so that we can go to a good university, get into a good school. Once we get into university, then we're thinking about the same thing, making good grades, making a good impression on our professors so that we can hopefully make connections so that we can get a good job. And then after university studies, hopefully we get the good job that we were hoping for. And then once we get the good job that we've been hoping for, that we've been working for years, then we're thinking about, okay, well, now what? Well, maybe now marriage. Maybe now buying the house. And then what? Well, then we build the family. God blesses me with children, with the family, and then what? At every phase of life, as soon as we reach the possession or obtain the possession for which we have been working, we almost immediately discover that that is not enough. There's always something more that the heart is yearning for. Because God has placed within all of our hearts the desire for the eternal, which is to say God. And only God can fulfill the desire of every human heart. God alone is eternal. God alone has existence in himself. Everything else depends on God. It's a hard lesson to learn, and usually only happens by God's grace first, and then by learning tough lessons. The gospel today is similar in the message. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to share the inheritance with me." A familiar scene, maybe a familiar experience even for some of you in the pews. I know that recently in my own life, in my own family, my last living, or one of my last living grandparents, my paternal grandmother, died just a few short years ago, and she had 7 sons and daughters. And as soon as she died, there was a small inheritance that the 7 siblings began to fight over. Immediately, a very sad situation. Heartbreaking for my dad, for sure, but even for the rest of the family, to see how something so insignificant became the source of division and conflict. Vanity of vanities, all things are vanity. Jesus responds to this person from the crowd, "Friend, who appointed me as your judge and arbitrator? Take care to guard against all greed, for though one may be rich, one's life does not consist in possessions." Going back to the image of bubbles or vapor or mist, as soon as you try to grasp it, it vanishes. And so it is with everything that is created. I mean, even my life will come to an end. Nothing endures forever outside of God. So then what can I build my life upon? Where can I find life? Jesus. Jesus is the pattern for living. Jesus is the model for which we can find life in its fullness, that we can live joyfully even if we might be suffering trial and tribulation. Jesus is the pattern for life because he is life. I am the way and the truth and the life. Jesus is the one in whom we find true and enduring living. So then how do we live it? How do we get planted into the life of God, into the divinity of God? Well, we have to follow his example. And we can look at good living, we can look at divine living, or at least characterize it by saying, giving myself away, which is precisely what Jesus did in his life. I mean, he gave himself away being born. He gave himself away in such a humble way that we struggle to even really comprehend the great humility of God. He was born in a stable, surrounded by animals, laid in a manger, which is to say a feeding trough where animals would feed. He lived a quiet, private life for about 30 years, and then he had 3 years of public ministry where he would preach and teach and perform miracles, walk on water, heal people, cast out demons, raise people from the dead. But in the end, and throughout his life, he was giving himself away. And the culmination of that mission that the Father gave him was found on the cross, the ultimate gift of self. Hanging on the cross is where we find life. Life is found in giving yourself away, and it is not found in possessions. The one who wishes to save his life must lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Jesus then told a parable. There was a rich man whose land produced a bountiful harvest, and he asked himself, "Self, what shall I do? For I do not have space to store my harvest. This is what I shall do. I shall tear down my barns, build larger ones. Then I shall store all my grain and other goods, and I shall say to myself, now as for you, you have so many good things stored up for many years. Rest, eat, drink, be merry." He was getting ready to have a life of comfort. He had worked hard for years, and then now he wanted to sit back on the porch and have a nice, cold, spicy margarita. And then God comes to him and says, "You fool, tonight your very life will be demanded of you." For what? What's all the hard work that I do for, if even my very life is something that I cannot protect from death in the end? I can mitigate risk. I can make decisions that might reduce my probability of dying, but in the end, I know that I will die. So how do I store up for myself treasure in heaven? What is the treasure in heaven that has been prepared for me? The treasure that's available to all of us by God's grace, that we might actually win one day by God's blessing and my cooperation, is God himself. He is the treasure on the other side of death that awaits me. We get to see God face to face in his kingdom. Moses begged God to see his face, and he told him no. God simply allowed him to see the back of himself. No one has seen the face of God and lived. But when we're called home, if we have lived a faithful life, a life full of self-gift, then we will have the opportunity to reach the treasure that is prepared for us. God himself is the treasure. So here's the challenge. Twofold. We can summarize the lessons that we're hearing about in the readings today by the spiritual principle of detachment. To be detached from everything in the world is how the Christian should live, which is not to say that I need to renounce all material goods or that material goods are bad in themselves. That's not what Jesus is saying. He's not saying that riches in itself is bad. Certainly not. But if I am so attached to the things of this world, and maybe even good things, if I'm so possessed by them, that's where I make the mistake. So the challenge, the first part of it, is to identify what is something that I am attached to that might even be good, that the Lord is inviting me to foster a spirit of detachment to this thing or even this person. And if I might propose to you something that I think in general tends to be the pitfall or the trap for mothers. Mothers generally fall into the trap of wanting to possess their children, to hold on to them. Well, these are my sons and daughters. I carried them. They belong to me. Well, indeed, that's true. They are yours. But more importantly, they belong to God. These are sons and daughters of God the Father. And he loves them more than you ever could. He will provide for them. Fathers, generally, tend to put over and above things like work, Well, I have to provide for the family. That's my duty. That's my job. That's what the responsibility I have as a husband, as a father. True, yes, but not to the detriment of time with the family. Falling into the trap of workaholism, putting work to an inordinate level in your life as a priority. So you can fall into that trap even with good intentions, wanting to provide for the family, and then as a consequence of that good intention, well, you lose your family because you don't know them, because you don't spend time with them. Detachment from everything in life, not to renounce it, but to have it in its proper order. And then children too. I want to challenge all the children in the church to foster a spirit of detachment. And I would say, at least for most of you, it's going to be from things. Maybe your tablet, or maybe your phone. Maybe a detachment for those who have access to social media. Detachment from social media. So to detach from something that you are trying to possess. So that's part one of the challenge. Part two is, to do something positive. To develop virtue. There are 4 cardinal virtues that we should really be focused on trying to develop in our own lives. Prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. They're called cardinal because they are directional. They give us good direction in life. So I want to challenge you today to pick one of the cardinal virtues. If you're not familiar with what they are, we'll look them up first. Pick one. And then try to develop that virtue every day this week. So what is a virtue in itself? A virtue in itself, the Catechism says, is a habitual and firm disposition to do good. Which means it happens naturally because I've been practicing it so much. So the just man possesses justice because he's developed it over time. The person who practices and possesses the virtue of temperance knows how to keep things in their proper proportion because they have trained their body not to overeat or to overdrink or to undereat or underdrink, to temper everything that we do. So the twofold challenge this week is, one, to recognize and acknowledge something that I am attached to that I need to detach from, and then to develop one virtue this week. What's the purpose of the challenge? The purpose is that we might store up treasure in heaven, that I may not be so attached to anything other than God, that God will be the source of my life, the foundation upon which I build healthy life. You fool, this night your life will be demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, to whom will they belong? Thus will it be for all who store up treasure for themselves, but are not rich in what matters to God.